Minasan namaste. Nihongo no UGC no Ipichi Pachala yokoso. Watashi wa Kanna Anita Tomoshimasu. Today's paper is paper 15, an introduction to Japanese literature. And today's module is on Japanese aesthetics. In the last lesson on Japanese aesthetics, we had learned about, or rather made a few observations about what is mono no aware. Now, in continuation, a famous critic and scholar of ancient learning of 18th century, Motori Norinaga, characterized the tale of Genji as a novel of mono no aware. Characterized a phrase which has something sad about it, and it is translated as the sadness of things. Although it could also be mentioned that earlier we took it as the sensitivity to things, to the fall of flowers, or let's see how Murasaki Shikibu, the famous writer of the tale of Genji, thinks about mono no aware. In this novel, she writes, someone asks which chapter is the best and creates the most profound impression. Quote, no chapter is superior to Kiritsubo. From the opening words at the court of an emperor without any timeline mentioned in this case, to the final description of Genji's initiation to manhood, the whole chapter is filled with the spirit of moving, that is, aware, and the colors, the language, and the circumstances portrayed thereby, and everything else is in tune with the aware patha. Likewise, in the chapter The Broom Tree, the discussion on a rainy night is carried on about the categories of women, and it contains many praiseworthy points. It speaks for the sense of beauty appreciated by Japanese men. Likewise, in the chapter Yugao, named after the delicate beauty, is permeated with the moving spirit of aware or sadness. The description of Genji leaving the capital for Suma and about his life in the distant exile thereafter are extremely moving. In Heian period, it must be pointed that aware was rated more for its deep emotion. It was more like something charming and unusual. And another term of aesthetic criticism, and more cheerful and positive in nature, is Okashi. Over the time, the meaning of Okashi has changed to something which is different from its original meaning as found in Pillow Book, and it seems it was something which is delightful, a smile to the face, and did not apply to the serious, sad things. It seems that both Awari and Okashi are best used by Murasaki Shikibu. Another term associated with the aesthetics of Heian period, which is marked by the conspicuous presence of aristocracy, is Miyabi. Literally, it means courtliness, or in general, one may say refinement. Since the Heian society focused mainly on the aristocrats, all those outside that were considered to be uncourtly or uncourtliness, unrefined or ignorant. By courtliness, they meant was the decorum for lords and ladies at the palace, something like the British. Also, it implied the Japanese reflection of the culture, a kind of refined culture which had been influenced by the Chinese fashion and styles. One can imagine Miyabi was the most inclusive term for describing the aesthetic of Heian period, something which was severed by the aristocrats of the times. And they had been educated to be sensitive to these, like the plum blossoms or delicate robes or the mannerism. In short, Miyabi was, in a sense, something which was not just the plain simple virtue or sincerity, but it was refinement which gave the courtiers a justification for their own style of living and a contempt for those who were non courtly. The tale of Genji is not only a handwork of various refined emotions and aesthetics, but it also refers to the art of novel, which officially or publicly was defined and redefined only after the influence of Western culture and Western literature. Although not theoretically defined, the art of novel had been there in the fine prose of Genji Monogatari and other works like Makura no Soshi, the Pillow Book, as well as in the medieval works. In the words of translation of Genji from Valley on page 253 to 57, which is translated by Valley as a wreath of cloud. It is given like this. The tale of Genji has been read and commented on ever since it was first written almost 1,000 years ago, and many theories have been advanced as to what the author Murasaki Shikibu was attempting to express in her novel. In this excerpt from the tale of Genji, we find that what is perhaps is the best answer to this question. It seems likely that Murasaki was here in one of the earliest and most famous examples of Japanese criticism, stating her own views on the function of the novel. One day, Genji, going around with a number of romances which he had promised to lend, came to Tama Katsura's room and found her, as usual, hardly able to lift her eyes from the book in front of her. Really, you are incurable, he said, laughing. I sometimes think that young ladies exist for no other purpose than to provide purveyors of the absurd and improbable with a market for their wares. I am sure that the book you are now so intent upon is full of the wildest nonsense. Yet, knowing this all the time, you are completely captivated by its extravagances and follow them with the utmost excitement. Why, here you are on this hot day, so hard at work that though I am sure you have not the least idea of it. Your hair is in the most extraordinary tangle. But there, I know quite well that these old tales are indispensable during such weather as this. How else would you all manage to get through the day? Now, for a confession, I too have lately been studying these books and have, I must tell you, been amazed by the delight which they have given to me. There is, it seems, an art of so fitting each part of the narrative into the next that, though all is mere invention, the reader is persuaded that such things might easily have happened, and it is deeply moved as though they were actually going on around them. We may know with one part of our minds that every incident has been invented for the express purpose of impressing us. But we may all the while in another part of our minds be burning with indignation at the wrongs endured by some wholly imaginary princess. Or again, we may be persuaded by a writer into accepting the crudest absurdities, our judgment being as it were dazzled by sheer splendor of language. I have lately sometimes stopped and listened to one of our young people reading out loud to her companions and have been amazed at the advances which this art of fiction is now making. How do you suppose that our new writers come by this talent? It used to be thought that the author of a successful romance were merely particularly untruthful people whose imagination had been stimulated by constantly inventing plausible lies. But that is clearly unfair. Perhaps, she said, only people who are themselves much occupied in practicing deception have the habit of thus dipping below the surface. I can assure you that for my part, when I read a story, I always accept it as an account of something that has really and actually happened. Unquote. So saying, she pushed away from her book, which she had been copying. Genji continued. So you see, as a matter of fact, I think far better of this art than I have led you to suppose. Even its practical value is immense. Without it, what should we know of how people lived in the past, from the age of gods down to the present day? For history books such as the Chronicles of Japan, those show us only one small corner of life, whereas these diaries and romances which I see piled around you contain, I'm sure, the most minute information about all sorts of people and their private affairs. Unquote. He smiled and went on. Quote, but I have a theory of my own about what this art of the novel is and how it came into being. To begin with, it doesn't simply consist in the author's telling a story about the adventure of some other person. On the contrary, it happens because the storyteller's own experience of men and things, whether for good or ill, not only what he has passed through himself, but even events which he has only witnessed or been told of, has moved him to an emotion so passionate that he can no longer keep it shut up in his heart. Again and again, something in his own life or in that around him will seem to the writer so important that he cannot bear to let it pass into oblivion. There must never come a time, he feels, when men do not know about it. That is my view of how this art arose. Quote, clearly, then, it is no part of the storyteller's craft to describe only what is good or beautiful. Sometimes, of course, virtue will be his theme and he may then make such play with it, but he is just as likely to have been struck by numerous examples of vice and folly in the world around him, and about them he has exactly the same feeling as about the preeminently good deeds which he encounters. They are more important and must all be garnered in. Thus, anything whatsoever may become the subject of a novel, provided only that it happens in the mundane life and not in some fairy tale beyond our human ken. Unquote. Quote, the outward forms of this art will not, of course, be everything the same. At the court of China and in other foreign lands, both the genius of the writers and their actual methods of composition are necessarily very different from ours. And even here in Japan, the art of storytelling has, in course of time, undergone great changes. There will, too, always be a distinction between the lighter and the more serious forms of fiction. Well, I have said enough to show that when at the beginning of our conversation I spoke of romances as though they were mere frivolous fabrications, I was only teasing you. Some people have taken exception on moral grounds to an art in which the perfect and imperfect are set side by side. But even in the discourses which Buddha in his bounty allowed to be recorded contain passages that he learned and called upaya or adapted truth, a fact that has led some superficial person to doubt whether a doctrine so inconsistent with itself could possibly command our credence. Even in the scriptures of the greater vehicle, there are, I confess, many such instances. We may indeed go so far as to say that there is an actual mixture of truth and error. But the purpose of these holy writings, namely the compassing of our salvation, remains always the same. So too I think may it be said that the art of fiction must not lose our allegiance, because in the pursuit of the main purpose to which I have alluded above, it sets virtue by the side of vice, or mingles wisdom with folly. Viewed in this light, the novel is seen to be not, as is usually supposed, a mixture of useful truth with idle invention, but something which at every stage and in every part has a definite and serious purpose. Mutori Narinaga also wrote a famous work called Tama no Ogushi, Jeweled Comb, which is a study of Lady Murasaki's tale of Genji. In Tama no Ogushi, he gives a realistic appreciation of the emotional life of Genji and appraise it as one of the greatest expression of the Japanese spirit. Furthermore, while he comments on the what is good and what is evil in the novel, he is referring to the relative truth. To quote him, good and evil, as found in this tale, do not correspond to good and evil in Confucianism or Buddhist concepts. According to him, I mean Motori Norinaga, good and evil extend to all realms. Even with the human being, good and evil are not necessarily limited to his thinking and his conduct. Generally, rank and position imply good and evil. Thus, the noble person is regarded as good and the lowly as bad. Like this, while giving examples of what is considered to be good and what evil, he goes on to say that Good and evil are not constant, they change according to time and circumstance. For example, an arrow is good if it penetrates its object, while armor is good if it is impenetrable. In the heat of summer day, coolness is good, while in the cold of winter, heat is good. For the man who treads the road at night, darkness is bad. But for the one who seeks to conceal himself, moonlight is bad. In such a way, all things may be good or bad. Thus, too, the good and bad in man's mind and in his acts may not be opposed to each other as they seem. They differ according to the doctrines one follows. What Confucianism deems good, Buddhism may not, and what Buddhism considers good, Confucianism might regard as evil. According to him, Genji Monogatari is simply a tale of human life and doesn't profess about what is good and what is bad. The purpose of the tale of Genji, according to Motori Naga, is that it may be linked to the man who, loving the lotus flower, must collect and store muddy and foul water in order to plant and cultivate the flower. The impure mud is like illicit love affairs described in the tale. They are not for the purpose of being admired, but for the purpose of nurturing the flower of the awareness about the sorrow of human existence. According to him, Prince Genji's conduct is like the lotus flower, which is happy, fragrant, but which has its roots in filthy, muddy water. Here, the tale does not dwell on impurity of the water. It dwells only on those who are sympathetically kind and who are aware of the sorrow of human existence. And it holds these feelings to be the basis of a man or human existence, which he says as, according to his term, it is the good man.